Advisor, Zero Carbon Hydrogen Australia. Mateo Ugues, Director Asia HDF Energy. Ms. Julia Sauder, CEO Long Duration Energy Storage Council and Chair of the Global Renewables and Alliance. Dr. Rahul Walawakar, President, India Energy Storage Alliance and MD for Customized Energy Solutions. And Dr. Lauren Anthony, Executive Director, IHPE, or International Partnership for Hydrogen and Fuel Cells in the Economy. And of course, Jonas Moberg, CEO of Green Hydrogen Organization. Thank you all for being here. We've got a really distinguished panel. I'm not going to read through all the bios because of paucity of time, so they're all up on the website. You can look them up. I know, Scott, you need to leave, so perhaps we could have you kick off. I know you've got a slide to show, and then I'll follow up with questions. Wherever you feel comfortable.
Hello, Scott Hamilton from the Smart Energy Council and Zero Carbon Hydrogen Australia. Thank you for having us here, first of all, and congratulations to all the people that have put this together, and a shout out for some of our very close member partners and members, including Fortescue Future Industries, CWP Global, Yara, and as well as New Power. That's one of our very dear friends in India. We first got involved in renewable hydrogen certification, green hydrogen certification, about 4 years ago. And essentially the major driver for that was that our large companies, many of them that I just mentioned, wanted to build green hydrogen plants but couldn't get the investors to get the financial close. Yes, the offtake is an issue, but I'll go there another day. And so basically, part of that was because investors wanted to have certainty with what they were going to be investing in, what the product was going to look like when it was coming out the other end. And so we actually did a piece of work to scour the world on all the various certification programs that were around. And frankly, there was a lot. But there was also very, very slow, taking years and years to develop these standards of programs. Way too long. And just to put that in perspective, we've got 6 years and 2 days until we will have exhausted the global climate budget for 2030 to keep it to 1.5 degrees. 6 years and 2 days. Standards process are enormously complicated and take an enormous amount of time. So we went and developed our own standard and certification scheme. And I'm very proud to say that we have now certified 3 projects within Australia. We started off with certification a refueling station, which was actually perfect because it was small and it was tight. We then looked at and we did a certification of a green ammonia plant. Yara's plant in the Pilbara, one of the biggest fertiliser plants in the world, is now going to green ammonia. And again, we went in there with Yara and with a certifying body to basically give it the guarantee that what they will be making will be green. And finally, we've actually just last month done another certification project with Frontier Energy that's building a very large plant down in the other end of Western Australia, but also using energy from the grid as well as their behind-the-meter power as well. So it's a different scenario as well. So I'm very pleased to say that we've been able to do that to prove that it can be done. But we need to do this much, much more on a much grander scale. And that's why I'm really so pleased with the Green Hydrogen Organisation sort of approach to work with industry and governments around the world to get this done. We can't wait for governments to come up with the standards and then industry says, oh, that's not going to work anyway. We need to move forward and make it happen. I've got a slide that I would also like to show, just if I've got time. And it is unfortunate that I've got to put this slide up because I'm here at this Clean Energy Ministerial and still hearing a lot about blue hydrogen and carbon capture and storage. And frankly, even if you could make it so that you could capture the carbon dioxide and put it into the used gas wells, you still have significant emissions that are residual, which still have to be dealt with. And I am very convinced, as the chair of Green Hydrogen Organisation says, blue hydrogen is a con. We need to say no. And the standards and the governments need to say no. And the reason why that is because we're also talking about a $1.4 trillion market. That's what green hydrogen is going to be worth in this next little while. So we can't have these holes, leakage, ability for people to scam and play the market in order to get the rewards of the money while the planet continues to burn. The way to do that, we would say, and I'm sure that I hope my panel members would also say, rule out anything but hydrogen coming from renewable energy. And similarly, that doesn't mean that we don't need governments to play a role, because we still need as well behind, well not well behind, but soon after the industry gets out and gets it done. Otherwise, we're going to spend our next 6 years fiddling while the world burns. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. And I know you have to leave. That was a really good perspective, but I think if I could just ask you a quick question before you leave. Can you give us a sense, since you've already started certification programs, what is the cost of certification relative to project cost?
Yeah, so it depends on the project, first of all, and essentially what we do as the independent peak body is we actually employ a certifier and auditor. So Bureau Veritas was the one that we used for Yara, that many of in the room will actually know, to essentially go in and do an audit of its carbon intensity of that particular plant. Now, in terms of that plant, we're talking a first stage plant. It's in the order of tens of millions of dollars, and we're under $100,000 to give you a sense of the perspective. And it's also important, though, if I can just make one other point.
Sure, please.
I really also admire the green hydrogen catapult that includes many of the companies that we've talked about. We can't compete in this area. We need to work together, get behind each other, leverage off each other, because every time you do one of these certification projects, and we've only done 3, and we need to do many, many more, you learn by doing. And that's just so important that we share that learning and leverage off each other.
Thank you very much. If I can move over to Matteo, HDF is a developer, and just wondering if you could, you've started to look at some projects in Indonesia. We've talked a lot about enabling conditions and the right context. Why did you choose Indonesia, and what's attracted you to that market?
Well, thank you, Pradeep, for the question. Very simple question, but complicated answer. Firstly, when we talk about hydrogen, we think about the molecule, and everyone has in mind the potential of that molecule, hence the standards and certification. However, when you think about the markets, the application, you can have a big gap between what we do in Europe. I say we because I'm French. So what we do in Europe, what we do, I know, I have a tiny accent. So what we do Europe, Japan, Australia, US, Canada, and what we can do in developing countries. I say we because I live in Indonesia now. So Indonesia is an important market for us. That's why I'm based there. And we cover Asia from Indonesia. But we try to have a different approach in Indonesia or developing countries than what we would do in Europe, Japan, and Australia. Because if we want to sell hydrogen as a molecule in developing countries, we may struggle. The price is expensive, and we won't have access to subsidies in those countries. In France, for example, you have $9 billion euro available until 2030 to make the first projects happen, to scale up the industry, to make gigawatt factories, to reduce the cost. That won't happen in Indonesia. That won't happen in Philippines, neither in Vietnam, and so on. So to answer your question, we choose Indonesia despite what I just said, because you have isolated grids. And if you have isolated grids, you have expensive electricity, and you have little alternatives to the diesel genset there. For India, we can give the example of Andaman Islands, for example, Nicobar, Ladakh, and even in the south of India, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, you have some kind of isolated areas too, or grid edges issues. And in those contexts, the hydrogen has a role to play as a storage solution and can bring added value to the grid at a sustainable cost. We don't need necessarily subsidies, even though it's welcome. And I would link that to institutions like ADB, but I can mention World Bank, AFD, and so on. We need the first projects to be materialized soon. So someone saying that we learn by doing, and that is true. The first projects are always more difficult. The EPC cost, the due diligences, the expectation from the lenders. So we need also leverages for the first projects. Concessional loan can be a solution. Grants also, even though we think the projects are sustainable, but it helps to go faster and to look at duplicability and to rely that to the topic of today. Standards and certifications and regulatory framework are key because it helps to address the key factor, and the key factor is the price. It can be green. It's not because it's green there will be off-taker. You know, if the chemical industry or refineries are not forced to buy green, they won't buy if it's not affordable. So those standards and certification should help us also to have a sort of framework, a sort of path for, as a developer, to reduce the cost. That is critical.
Thank you very much. I think having worked in Indonesia and lived there for a few years, there are islands where the cost of electricity can be as much as 40 cents a kilowatt hour. When you're moving diesel on boats for hours on end before it gets to the original destination. Thank you, Matteo. Julia, if I could shift to you, given